It's 1922. Egypt's Valley of the Kings is already famous. Howard Carter is weeks away from finding Tutankhamun's tomb just a few miles from here. But a different team, working for New York's Metropolitan Museum of Art, is digging in a much less glamorous spot, a rock quarry near a half-buried temple at Deir el-Bahari. And they find something strange. Not treasure, not gold. A pit filled with broken statues, hundreds of them, faces smashed off, names chiseled out, bodies snapped in half and thrown in like garbage. Every statue is of the same woman, a pharaoh, carved wearing the false beard and crown of a king, because in ancient Egypt, that's what a king looked like, even when the king was female. Someone had taken the time to destroy her, piece by piece, and bury the evidence. Her name was Hatshepsut. She once ruled the most powerful civilization on Earth for over 20 years, longer than almost any other woman in ancient history. And after she died, someone tried very hard to make sure nobody would ever know that. The question this documentary answers isn't just who she was, it's why someone worked so hard to make her disappear, and how 3,000 years later, we found her anyway. To understand how unusual Hatshepsut's story is, you have to understand how strict the rules of Egyptian kingship normally were. The pharaoh wasn't just a job, it was a role built into the entire structure of the universe, as ancient Egyptians understood it. The king was the living link between the gods and the people, responsible for maintaining order, balance, truth. And that role was, almost without exception, filled by a man. Hatshepsut wasn't supposed to be an exception. She was born around 1500 BCE, the daughter of Pharaoh Thutmose I and his principal wife, Amosa. That made her about as royal as it was possible to be. When her father died, she followed the expected script perfectly. She married her own half-brother, Thutmose II, a common practice among Egyptian royalty, meant to keep the bloodline pure, and became his great royal wife, the highest-ranking woman in the kingdom. For a while, that was the whole story. Wife of the king, not king herself. Then Thutmose II died young, probably in his 20s, and Egypt suddenly had a problem. The new pharaoh, Thutmose III, was next in line. But he wasn't Hatshepsut's son. He was Thutmose II's child by a secondary wife, and by most estimates, he was still a small boy. Egypt needed someone to actually run the country while the king finished growing up. That someone was Hatshepsut. This part isn't unusual at all. Royal women acting as regents for child pharaohs happened before in Egyptian history. If Hatshepsut had simply managed the kingdom for a few years, and then quietly stepped aside once Thutmose III came of age, she'd be a footnote today. She didn't step aside. Somewhere around her 7th year as regent, Hatshepsut did something almost no woman in Egyptian history had done before her. She had herself crowned pharaoh, not queen, not regent, but king, with the full formal titles, the crook and flail, the false ceremonial beard worn by every male pharaoh before her. Temple inscriptions even began referring to her with male grammar in some contexts, His Majesty, while other texts kept her female titles intact. She ruled as both. Thutmose III didn't disappear. He kept his title too. For roughly 2 decades, Egypt had 2 pharaohs, a boy who would one day become one of history's great military commanders, and the woman who currently outranked him. How does someone even get away with that, in a system this rigid? Partly through raw political skill. Hatshepsut surrounded herself with loyal, capable officials, most famously her chief steward, Senenmut, a commoner who rose to oversee her building projects and tutor her daughter, Neferure. And partly through a message aimed squarely at the gods. Temple reliefs at her mortuary temple claim that Hatshepsut wasn't just royal by blood. She was divinely fathered by the god Amun himself, making her kingship not a break in tradition, but exactly what the gods intended all along. Whether Egypt's priesthood and nobility genuinely believed that, or simply found it convenient to go along with a competent ruler, is something historians still debate. What isn't in doubt is that it worked. And here's what tends to surprise people. Hatshepsut wasn't a placeholder ruler quietly waiting to be pushed aside. Her reign is considered by most Egyptologists to have been one of genuine prosperity. She launched one of ancient Egypt's most ambitious trade expeditions, sending ships down the Red Sea to the fabled land of Punt, likely somewhere along the coast of modern-day Somalia or Eritrea, though its exact location is still debated. The ships came back loaded with incense, ebony, ivory, gold, exotic animals, and living myrrh trees, which were replanted at her temple. The whole voyage is carved in extraordinary detail on the temple walls, down to a rather blunt portrait of the Puntite queen, drawn with an unusual body shape that Egyptian artists clearly found remarkable enough to record accurately rather than flatteringly. She also built her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari, the very site where those smashed statues would later be found, is still considered one of the architectural masterpieces of the ancient world. 3 vast terraces cut directly into limestone cliffs, designed tradition credits by Senenmut himself. Meanwhile, young Thutmose III wasn't sitting idle either. Evidence suggests he was being trained for exactly what he'd eventually become: Egypt's most formidable military pharaoh, a man later historians would nickname the Napoleon of Egypt for the scale of his conquests. Military campaigns continued during Hatshepsut's reign, some apparently even crediting both rulers jointly. For 20-odd years, this arrangement, awkward as it sounds on paper, simply worked. No surviving evidence shows Thutmose III publicly challenging her. No palace coup, no dramatic falling out. Just 2 pharaohs, one clearly senior, running an empire. Then, around 1458 BCE, Hatshepsut died, likely in her late 40s or 50s, with some medical evidence from her mummy later suggesting she suffered from diabetes and possibly bone cancer. And Thutmose III finally became sole ruler of Egypt, at last, in his own right. Here's where the story most people know ends, and where the real mystery begins. For decades, the popular version of this story went something like this. Thutmose III, humiliated for 20 years by a stepmother who took the throne that was rightfully his, waited until she was safely dead and then erased her out of pure resentment. It's a satisfying story. A wronged prince finally getting his revenge. It's also, according to more recent research, probably too simple. Because here's the detail that doesn't fit. The destruction of Hatshepsut's monuments doesn't appear to have started right after her death. Based on the style of later inscriptions carved over the damage, much of the erasure campaign appears to date from late in Thutmose III's reign, as much as 20 years after Hatshepsut had died. If this were personal revenge from a bitter young king, why wait 2 decades to act on it? Many people assume the answer has to be jealousy or hatred. It's the version that shows up in most documentaries, and there's a certain emotional logic to it. But when Egyptologists, notably researchers like Peter Dorman, who studied the timing of the damage closely, looked at when the erasure actually happened, a different explanation started to look more likely. By the time the destruction campaign ramped up, Thutmose III was an old man, and his own son, the future Amenhotep II, was approaching the throne. Amenhotep II's own claim to kingship, unlike his father's, was not especially strong through the traditional line. Removing Hatshepsut from the official record, chiseling her name and image off monuments, walling up her obelisks inside a new structure at Karnak, leaving her out of official king lists that jumped straight from Thutmose II to Thutmose III, had a very practical political effect. It erased the precedent of a female pharaoh and cleaned up the succession story so that power appeared to pass in an unbroken male line, right down to Amenhotep II. In other words, this likely wasn't about punishing a stepmother he'd resented since childhood. It looks more like a calculated act of dynastic housekeeping, aimed at protecting the throne for the next generation. Cold, maybe, but not necessarily personal. That doesn't mean every act of destruction had this single motive. Some later kings simply reused convenient stone, and some Egyptologists still argue personal resentment played a role alongside politics. The honest answer is that historians don't have a signed confession, but the timing is a serious clue, and it's reshaped how many historians now read this entire episode. Either way, the effect was the same. For nearly 3,000 years, Hatshepsut all but vanished from Egyptian history. Ironically, one of the erasure campaign's most thorough acts of destruction may have accidentally preserved evidence for us. At Karnak, workers building a new structure encased two of Hatshepsut's massive obelisks in sandstone, hiding them from view and unintentionally protecting the delicate carvings from 3,000 years of weather and later vandalism. When one of those obelisks was uncovered in the modern era, its inscriptions were almost pristine. For most of history, though, the erasure worked exactly as intended. Hatshepsut wasn't in the king lists ancient Egyptian priests compiled for later generations. She wasn't part of the story Egypt told itself about its own past. When 19th century Egyptologists first began translating hieroglyphs at her temple, they were confused by inscriptions that seemed to describe a male king using female grammar and by conflicting titularies that didn't match any known pharaoh. It took years of careful work to realize they weren't looking at a scribal error. They were looking at a woman who had ruled as king and had been systematically written out of the record afterward. The rediscovery didn't stop with hieroglyphs. In 2007, a team led by Egyptologist Zahi Hawass used a small wooden box, inscribed with Hatshepsut's name and containing a single tooth, to help identify her actual mummy, previously an unlabeled body known only as KV60A, sitting largely unexamined for decades. CT scans showed a tooth socket in the mummy's jaw, missing exactly the tooth from that box. Most Egyptologists now accept this as Hatshepsut, though a handful have urged some caution given how the identification method has been questioned in later reviews. Either way, after a rediscovery process that took over a century, historians could finally say with real confidence, this is her. What survived, the temple, the trade reliefs, the obelisks accidentally preserved under later stone, has reshaped what historians understand about power in the ancient world. Hatshepsut wasn't a brief anomaly or a placeholder between real kings. She ran a stable, prosperous kingdom for 2 decades and did it well enough that the eventual sole ruler she made way for, Thutmose III, inherited an empire strong enough to go on and conquer much of the Near East. There's something almost fitting about how this story came back to us. The people who tried to erase Hatshepsut left evidence of the erasure itself. Smashed statues buried rather than destroyed completely, obelisks hidden rather than torn down, gaps in king lists specific enough to raise questions once someone knew to look. History, it turns out, is hard to fully delete. You can chisel a name off a wall. You can leave a ruler out of the official record for 100 generations. But the physical world tends to keep receipts, buried in a quarry pit, sealed inside a wall, waiting for someone curious enough to ask why the record doesn't quite add up. Hatshepsut ruled Egypt for about 20 years, built one of the ancient world's great temples, and sent ships to the edge of the known world and back. Someone, generations later, decided none of that should be remembered. They were wrong.